Conference speech that Chad actually presented at. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please use the question or chat function in your taskbar for the webinar, and we'll get through them at the end of the webinar. Chad?
Great, thank you, Kim. First of all, I just want to thank you for joining our webinar today, and enjoyed speaking with many of you at the PDS conference and learning about your businesses and discussing the data breach issue that is on many of your minds today. So today we're going to discuss what's new, what's happened since PDS, because we've had a lot of interesting developments, new breaches that have happened since the show, even since the show, and why today really protection is not an option. Unfortunately, in our climate today, there's no choice. If you're going to secure your business, you really need to protect your customers' data. And then what can you do today? What are the next steps to secure your network to protect your customers' data? So we'll get straight into the presentation. What's happened since PDS? There's been a lot more news develop and come out about the Target data breach. And one of the key things that is really interesting is to watch the shopper satisfaction scores. They have fallen dramatically since the breach. In our presentations, based on our research, we find that the average customer satisfaction score drops at least 13% after a breach, which may not sound like a lot, but it's a pretty good number and can be very devastating to your business. Target's satisfaction scores with their wealthiest shoppers dropped 9%. And with their really bread and butter shoppers, their middle class, dropped 12%, and that's just so far. So that is a pretty devastating number for them. They've also had pretty significant financial losses. They have paid at this point, and they're not done, I'm sure, at least $400 to $450 million for this breach. Their net income fell 46%. So they are definitely feeling the pain from this breach. Also, if you look at some of the data that's come out about the breach and the fact that Trustwave was their QSA working with them, one thing that we bring up is sometimes it feels painful to go through the steps to become PCI compliant, but when you take shortcuts, in the end, it can really bite you. You need to make sure that you don't take shortcuts. PCI, especially for a small business, is very much an honor system. But if you just check yes to all the questions on your self-assessment questionnaire, you could end up in a situation like Target. And so the interesting thing about them is they received a clean bill of health. They were considered PCI compliant in their audit. So obviously they had not taken some of the steps needed. And it's just a good example of taking shortcuts that can end up hurting you in the end. There have been a lot of lawsuits and issues with Trustwave and Target. The biggest being with the banks. We talked about this at the PDS show, and I asked for kind of an informal survey about whether people thought that Target handled the breach well, and overwhelmingly most people did not think they handled the breach well. Actually, banks and local banks handled the breach very well. They were quick to react. They were very proactive, and so the banks were left on the hook for being more proactive than Target. And there were some lawsuits that were filed, and many of the banks did end up dropping the lawsuits, but they definitely were trying to go after Target and Trustwave because they had a lot of costs, upfront costs, and time and effort to try to protect their customers immediately from the breach. So Target was not the only one breached. Since the conference, we've found that Neiman Marcus had 1.1 million credit cards exposed. And one interesting thing to note about this article is that it talks about it was over a 3-month period of time. And we quote that. I mean, at least hacks aren't something that happen immediately. I always say it's not like if somebody stole your purse at Walmart and ran out and used your credit card immediately at the gas station. This is something that is happening over a long period of time. So at least 3 months usually is what we see on average, how long the attack is taking place before it's discovered. And if you look at the Neiman Marcus attack, that is very much in line with that estimate. Also, if you look at the Neiman Marcus attack, it ended up being linked to a Russian organization, and that's another thing that we see quite often. These aren't teenagers in their mother's basements doing this. These are very complex organizations that are perpetrating these. So this is very, very consistent with what we see in the market today. It's also happening in multiple areas of the retail segment. So this isn't something that just happens in the restaurant segment or in the typical retail store segment. This happens in hospitality as well. There was a property investment company that was also breached since the PDS show that owned Marriott, Sheraton's, Renaissance, and many of you know if you go to a hotel that storing credit cards is something that they have done for years just to take the reservation. And so there was a big credit card breach that happened to this investment company as well. Sally Beauty is another example, and this was another attack that happened over the course of several months before they actually discovered it. It's another great example. And then the California DMV. This is something that doesn't just happen to retail. Anywhere that there is sensitive information that is stored, that's fair game. I have many pharmacies that come up to me and at the conference that said, why would this happen to me? I own one pharmacy in Podunk, in some state. If it can happen to a motor vehicle organization, it can happen to you too. They are indiscriminate about who they are attacking. They're looking for vulnerabilities and they're looking for sensitive data, and that's all they need. So now that we're up to date on data breaches, I want to review PCI in general. Where did it come from? How did this whole thing get started, and why are we where we are today? So PCI was formed, and the PCI data security standard was formed from all of the card brands that got together. So Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express. The organization was formed for really one reason, to push the liability for a data breach down to the merchant and to make them responsible for securing their customers' data and be financially responsible if the data was compromised. So they established a securities council that came up with core requirements that are separated into 12 categories and then 250 plus sub-requirements. And many of these requirements are very IT geek. They're not necessarily easy to understand. And there's even debate between quality security assessors, which we are, ANX is a QSA, even some debate about those sub-requirements and the intent. So in other words, a small business owner like yourself, some of this stuff is very confusing and it's daunting. It's not the type of terminology that you're used to seeing on a daily basis. It is a mandatory requirement. It's not a law. It's not enforced by the government, but it is enforced by every major credit card institution. So if you do want to take credit cards and continue to take credit cards, then you are required to comply with this process. and we'll talk more about what is required and some of the details a little later. It is a hard process. We recognize it. They recognize it. But it's something that is not a choice at this point. So why is it not an option? And what are some of the myths? We hear these myths every day when we talk to small business owners, not just pharmacies, but big businesses, small businesses. And so we'll run through a few of these because I'm sure that some of these are running through your mind right now. So one, it doesn't apply to my business. I hear this a lot. I don't do that many credit card transactions. Well, if you process one credit card throughout the year, you are subject to PCI. So that is a myth taken off the table. When you sign your merchant agreement, you are signing contracts saying that you agree to follow PCI requirements. I'm already PCI compliant. 90% of businesses that we talk to, large to small, tell us that they're compliant, and with 3 audit questions, we can usually prove that they're not. And I'll share those 3 questions with you in a couple of slides. I have a firewall in place, so I'm compliant. My IT guy has us all covered. We're protected. Our network is secure. That's great. That's the first thing I'll tell people is I'm very happy that you've taken those steps because that is a big step, securing your network. Unfortunately, PCI is more than just network security. It's a process. There are many things that you have to do that are part of the PCI compliance process that aren't just firewall or network specific. So it's important that you follow all of the steps and all the guidelines of PCI, because if you don't, you are still subject to those fines and fees if you get breached. My fill in the blank has me covered. So my bank has me covered. My franchisor has me covered. My point of sale system has me covered. Don't ever think for a minute that somebody else has you covered and that you're PCI compliant because somebody else that doesn't have a stake in your business has you covered. You are solely responsible for your compliance, and you should take it very seriously. If you can demonstrate compliance, then you aren't subject to many of those fines and fees that are charged based on getting breached. And 96% of breached businesses are not PCI compliant. So, even though many of these big companies will have auditors come in, sometimes they cut corners, and that's what we see with many of these large companies. Just to get compliant and say that they have the certificate, that's not good enough. You're not doing yourself any favors. You need to take the appropriate and necessary steps to get compliant. Unfortunately, 1 in 6 small businesses will suffer a credit card breach in the next 24 months. I could say this 2 years ago and nobody would believe me, but you can see just since the PDS conference, the companies that have been breached. Many times you don't hear about the small businesses that are out there. We hear about them every day. Small franchise owners, small business owners. Unfortunately, it's just a way of life now. So you may not hear about them every day, but we do, and we understand that it's a big threat. And people always say to us, once they've been breached, why didn't I just take the steps necessary and be proactive? Because trust me, it's much easier to do this in a proactive way and take the time that it takes to get compliant when you're not under the gun. Because if you get breached, then you will be required before you can take credit cards again to get 100% compliant and prove it. And so this is something that is a much easier process if you do it proactively than if you wait. So let's talk about the impact of a breach. The average cost of a data breach is $80,000 per location. And this is not $80,000 for Target. This is $80,000 for your average small business owner. Pharmacies just like yours, that would be $80,000 per location that you own. And just to kind of outline the costs associated with a breach, to see how that number adds up, the first thing that you have to do if you get breached is you have to conduct a forensic audit, and that's about a $20,000 expense. There's no choice. you don't have any choice in that matter, you will be required to conduct that audit. And that audit really is what it sounds like. I mean, they're gonna look at how big the breach was, what the scope was, how it happened, how many credit cards were involved, so that they can determine, one, if you were compliant, at what level you were at for compliance, and how many cards that you're going to have to pay for. And that's where the next number comes from. Every card that is compromised, it's not the banks that pay for those cards, it's going to be you. They're going to make you foot the bill, and that can run anywhere from $20 to $50 per card. So just think about it. If you want to do the math in your mind, how many credit cards, unique credit card numbers, do you process in, say, a 3-month period of time? You would have to replace all those cards at a $20 to $50 rate per card. Can add up very quickly. Plus any legal fees that you have, if you're levied fines, all of those charges can add up very quickly to $80,000. Also, when you look at an $80,000 expense, typically a small business just cannot handle that. They cannot survive an $80,000 expense. And at the same time, keep in mind, you're having to deal with this $80,000 expense, and you're also not able to take credit cards. You will not be able to take credit cards until you can prove compliance. That could be a month, could be 2 months. So you have cash flow issues, and you have an $80,000 hit. 70% of small businesses go out of business within 1 year because of simply they just cannot afford it. And again, 96% of these businesses were not compliant. And we've talked about these stats. It's an average of 210 days between when the intrusion takes place and when it's actually detected. So by the time you hear about the breach, it's already happened. There's nothing you can do to stop it. This is something you really do have to be proactive about. So why are you being targeted? And you are being targeted. The smallest business owners are a great target for these hackers. And we're going to talk about why you're such a great target in this slide. First of all, many small businesses have outdated firewalls, or I talked to many of you at the show and you didn't even have firewalls. Most people are confused about what a firewall is. They think that their router is a firewall, or they just don't understand firewall technology. Some people try to buy firewalls off the shelf, like at a big box store. The kind of firewall that you need in your business is an enterprise class firewall, and they generally cost thousands of dollars. And most small businesses don't really even understand what kind of firewall you need. So it's real easy for an attacker to get into your point of sale system or to get into one of your other pharmacy systems without a proper firewall in place or segmentation of your network. You might log in using a service like LogMeIn or GoToMyPC to access your store remotely. If you do not have two-factor authentication, then you are logging in and you're just opening up a tunnel for a hacker to get in. Two-factor authentication is something you know and something you have. So something you know is a password, something you have might be your cell phone with a unique ID that is text to you or an email. And just weak security configurations. Most small business owners don't know anything about network configurations. I mean, I was a small business owner, and I'm from the IT world, from telecom, and I have to admit that there's so many things I look back and I just didn't know. There's operating system flaws. Maybe you haven't updated your software, you haven't installed the patches necessary. If you have point of sale systems running on XP, which a lot of people do, then that is end of life. That is not going to be a PCI compliant system any longer. You don't train your staff well. Just no security policies or policies that aren't aligned with PCI. And it's just negligence. And negligence isn't because you're lazy. Negligence is because you don't know what you don't know. So that's why you're a perfect target for criminals. No pun intended. So we'll talk about financial institutions and how the impact there. So many people say, you know what, my bank has never required this from me. I don't need to do this because nobody asked me. And there is some truth to that, because as a level 4 merchant, as a small business owner, the banks may never ask you for proof of your compliance. But don't mistake that for the fact that you have to be compliant. You are required to be compliant. You may not be asked to provide proof, but you are required to show proof if they ask you. So you need to go ahead and take all the steps to protect yourself and also provide proof if you're asked. Some banks will ask you. Some banks are now cracking down, and they're asking for proof from level 4 merchants. And some acquiring banks are actually charging non-compliance fees. And it's a little bit of a scam. I mean, what they're doing is they're charging you, they're saying you've got to do all these steps, and then you say, that's too hard, and they're saying, well, we'll just charge you $50. Some people are even paying those non-compliance fees just because they don't want to deal with PCI compliance. Not a smart move. First of all, they're making money off of you really doing nothing. They're doing nothing but adding a line item on your bill. And two, you really do need to address your security and use that $50 you're paying more wisely, because it's not that much more just to go ahead and get compliant and get the tools you need. So here are the 3 audit questions that we have asked huge companies, that brand names that you would know, all the way down to a small business owner or a franchisee. And usually, I would say at least 90 to 96% of these companies answer no to at least one of these questions. So the first question is, have all of your employees upon hire and annually been trained on a security awareness course? Remember, this is not have they been trained on credit card swiping when you first hired them. It has to be a security awareness training course that you conduct upon hire and annually for each employee. And based on the turnover, I know it's difficult, but it is a requirement. The second is, have all employees read and signed a formal security policy? So again, if they just were hired and signed the policy in the beginning and you've never updated it, then you've missed the requirement. You have to update the policies every year. They have to include PCI requirements, and this has to be updated every year, and you have to have them sign it, acknowledge it, and they have to understand it. The third is, do you access your store remotely and use a 2-factor authentication method to do that? So if you're just using GoToMyPC or LogMeIn and you're not using 2-factor, generally the free versions do not have 2-factor. So if you answered no to even one of those questions, then you are not PCI compliant. I don't care what kind of firewall you have. I don't care what your IT person says. I don't care what your point of sale system says, your bank. Doesn't matter. If you answer no to one of those questions, you are not PCI compliant. So that's a great little informal audit that, like I said, we've conducted to large companies as well as small ones. And it really is an eye-opener for them. So what happens if you are breached? What's the pain involved? We talked a little bit about this already. Immediately, you're going to have to stop taking credit cards. That includes flexible spending cards. Those are issued by MasterCard, Visa. They're considered and treated just the same as any credit card. So just imagine in your business if you had to stop taking credit cards and flexible spending cards, how devastating that would be. How long could you survive, and how long could your cash flow survive if you could not take credit cards for a month, 2 months, maybe even 3 months? And then the forensic audit would be required. And then you have to implement remediation actions, which means, in simple terms, you have to get PCI compliant, and you have to prove that you're PCI compliant before you can take credit cards again. So it's not fun. It's not something that you want to experience, but it's something you should know. So we're going to talk about a risk assessment. And I know this sounds very formal, and it can be very detailed. A risk assessment is something that you can do internally. It's something that your IT guy can do. It's something that you can hire a company to do for you. But you want to look at your risk just like you would in any other part of your business, and ask yourself several questions and to determine, how big of a risk are you at in terms of your data security. And the first thing you want to look at is you want to look at your cardholder environment. How are you taking credit cards? Where is that information going? What are some of the gaps that you have within your network? Identify threats. Have you trained your employees? How is your point of sale system set up? Do you store credit cards? Identify vulnerabilities when you conduct your quarterly scans, and we'll talk about this in just a minute. Are you finding vulnerabilities that you need to fix? Again, software patches. And then you need to evaluate these risks, and you need to address them. You can't just look at these things and then put them off. You need to take the actions that you need to take immediately to mitigate that risk. So again, you can do this with your IT person. You can certainly do this yourself, or you can have a company like ours do it for you. So now we're going to talk about the ANX solution, and we're going to talk about this really in terms of kind of a buying guide, because a lot of the things we're going to talk about here are really minimum things that you need to do to be PCI compliant. The idea is you really need to take a proactive stance. You need to protect your business financially. You need to take the steps to get PCI compliant that are required. And so that's what we're going to go over. Many people don't understand what PCI compliance is and what are the real requirements. And we're going to break those down so you know the steps, the specific steps you need to take to get PCI compliant. And of course, how we can help. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to make sure that you can survive a data breach. And financially, that $80K can be so devastating that you need to make sure that if you do get breached, that you're not going to go out of business. And so we've put together a no strings attached program. We call it our data breach protection program. It's $100,000 worth of protection per location, and you're covered within 5 days of the contract execution. The great thing about this coverage, and it's pretty unique in the market, and this is something you really want to look for, because you can Google data breach protection program and find a ton of programs, but they aren't all created equal. And so we looked long and hard to make sure that we found one that covered these two criteria. The first is there's no safe harbor zone. Many of these programs require you to be compliant in order to get paid out. It's kind of an oxymoron. If you were compliant, likely, we just talked about 96% of businesses that were breached were not compliant. So it doesn't really help you if you, battened up all the hatches and done everything perfectly, right? So ours does not require that. You don't have to have lifted a finger to get compliant to be covered. Now, people ask, well, then why don't I just buy this protection and not do anything? The pain of getting breached is still there. You still are not allowed to take credit cards during that time, and you still have to get 100% compliant. So it's not a good plan to decide not to get compliant. Plus, your customers get a little miffed if you've been breached a couple of times. Obviously, you don't want to create a trust issue. You built your brand based on the years that you've been in your location and the trust you built. All that hard work sort of goes down the drain if you get breached. But this does help you keep your doors open in that event. It's also retroactive. So if you get breached and it's not reported, and the breach happens before we sign you up, then we still cover that breach. It just cannot have been reported. But the firewall is put in place. The breach has happened. We can see that there's been an intrusion. Then you are covered even before the contract signature, as long as it hasn't been reported. The next thing you have to do is you have to determine, okay, where am I at with compliance? Where you have to validate your current status of PCI compliance. And so generally you'll have a portal with almost any PCI compliance solution. We have a really great portal that has a knowledge base if you want to learn more about PCI. The big thing that I think is a great feature of ours is an SAQ wizard. You're required to fill out a self-assessment questionnaire on a yearly basis that you're answering questions about your network, about training, several components of PCI. It can be daunting. They're written in language that's not necessarily easy to understand. We have a wizard that's much like TurboTax that helps you get through those questions. And if you have questions about those questions, then there is an explanation within the wizard. You can also call us 24/7, 365 and ask questions as well. There's your quarterly scanning requirements. You're required to scan your network, and it will pick up any vulnerabilities that are there, any open ports, and it gives you a report and tells you how to fix those issues. That's all within the portal. It's all integrated within the portal. Also, if you have multiple stores, you can track the compliance. If you have 5 stores, you can see all 5 stores and where you're at with compliance for each of those stores. The nice thing is if you have a very consistent network between all 5 stores, you can set up a template and you don't have to go through all these steps over and over again. You can easily get through one and then just copy that information for each store. There's policy management. We talked about having policies that are up to date and acknowledged. We do have policy templates. You can have PCI policies in place very quickly with the find and replace feature. And then we have a policy management system that lets you email out and have your employees acknowledge the policies through the portal. So it makes it really easy. And then e-learning. You're required to train all of your cashiers upon hire and annually with the security awareness course. That course is integrated into the portal, and once they take the course, that information is uploaded and you can run the report. So once you have the procedure part in place, it makes it a lot easier to validate your compliance. This is all cloud-based. It's nothing you have to install on your devices, your computers. It's in the cloud. So we talked a little bit about the employee training already. Super simple to implement. We use registration codes, so you don't have to enter the employee's information in yourself. The employee gets a registration code, and then they enter their own information. The reminders are emailed year over year. The reporting is all just rolled up into the portal with basically one touch click, and you can see the report. The security policies, we talked about this. The templates are in there. They're easy to use. You can use the templates, use all of the policies within the templates. If you have your own policies, you can merge the two, but it makes it really easy if you're desperate to get compliant quickly. You can implement these policies immediately and just do a find and replace with your company name. The questionnaire, getting started with is half the battle. If you need help, it's there. One of the key things that is hard for a small business owner to do is to learn which self-assessment questionnaire to complete. We make it easy. You answer several easy questions that you're going to know the answers to, and it will direct you to the correct questionnaire and then walk you through step by step. On the vulnerability scan, all of this is run straight through the portal. You can schedule your scans. They need to be done quarterly, but you can do them as often as you want. You can also schedule these scans. They can be done without you having to schedule each quarter. And then the report is just emailed to you, and it's all stored within the portal. You know, the remediation generally isn't that difficult. If you have an issue or you're confused about something that you need to do, again, we offer our support for no extra charge, 24/7, 365 to answer any of your questions. So just to review, you're going to get financially covered through the Data Breach Protection Program. You're going to validate your level of compliance, determine your risk level, and then fix those processes to make sure that you have your employees trained, your policies implemented, and then really the next step is to make sure that your network is secure. And that's really when you need a managed firewall. And we call ours our Secure Cloud Gateway. And we can bundle this in, and it actually is it's integrated into the portal where it will actually pre-fill between 60 and 80% of the SAQ questions. So it makes it very easy to get through all the technical questions. And then really the final step is to have a partner like ANX to help you get through the compliance process, to handhold you, to answer the questions you need answered. It's, again, not an easy process, but it's something we can help you get through. You want